If you grew up in Canada, there was a box that meant Christmas. The rainbow across the lid, the young woman beside it, the little printed map inside that told you which chocolate hid which center. It was Moirs' pot of gold, made in Nova Scotia, and for most of a century, it was the box you brought to the house, the one on the sideboard, the one somebody always raided for the last caramel. Behind that box was a giant. Moirs was once the largest candy factory in Canada. More than 1,000 workers, a downtown block, its name lit over Halifax Harbor. It survived fires, survived a near bankruptcy, survived the largest explosion of the age, 2 world wars, and 4 different owners. It survived all of it, and none of that is what killed it. Not a war, not a crisis, not a rival. What ended Canada's oldest candy empire came from a boardroom a border away. Not seized, but quietly let go, in the years it should have stood safest. What finally let it go? Chapter 1. Bread for the Garrison. The story begins on a hill above a cold Atlantic harbor, in a garrison town where the British Army needed feeding, and a Scottish family decided to feed it. Halifax in the early part of the 19th century was a fortress with a city attached. The citadel sat at the top of the hill, red-coated soldiers drilled on the common, and every one of those soldiers needed bread. That was the opening, not chocolate, not candy, not the rainbow that would one day glow over the skyline. Bread. Plain, daily, military bread. The sources argue about exactly who started it and exactly when. Some say Alexander Moir in the 1790s. Popular memory settled on 1815, and the number stuck so hard it ended up on the side of the building. But the historian Ian McKay, writing the definitive account of the family, put the spine of the thing plainly enough. A Scottish immigrant named Benjamin Moir ran a prosperous bread bakery in the center of Halifax, and when he died in 1845, he left it to his son. His name was William Church Moir. Born in Halifax in 1822, dead in 1896, and in the 74 years between those dates, he did something his father never imagined. He took a workshop and turned it into a factory. William was not a warm man. He was a builder, relentless, calculating, and impatient with anything that slowed the accumulation of capital. He won the big contracts to feed the garrison, and he used the money the way ambitious industrialists always used money in that century. He bought machines. In 1863 and 64, he brought steam baking technology across the Atlantic from Britain and the United States and installed it on Argyle Street. Halifax had never seen bread made like this, not by hand, loaf by loaf, but by machine, by the thousands. And then, in 1879, the government of Canada handed him a gift he hadn't asked for. The national policy. A wall of tariffs meant to protect Canadian manufacturing from cheaper goods coming in from outside. William Moir noticed something that would change everything. He testified to a government commission that the new policy did more for confectionery, for candy, than it ever did for flour or bread. So around 1873, William and his eldest son, James William Moir, had already begun moving into the sweeter, more profitable trade. Candy. And by the end of that decade, the sugar was earning more than the bread. Here, the family did something that the people of Halifax would tell stories about for 100 years. The tale most often repeated is that the Moirs built their own ships to carry cocoa beans across the ocean. It's a beautiful story. It's also almost certainly not true. What the record actually shows is stranger and, in a way, larger. William Moir poured his profits into an empire on the 9-Mile River at Bedford. Flour mills, woodworking mills, a paper box factory to make his own packaging, vast timberlands, real estate. He was building a machine that fed itself. Not ships full of cocoa, but a whole industrial hinterland. It nearly killed the company. The expansion was too much, too fast, and in 1881, the Moirs were forced to suspend payment, a step from bankruptcy, and the business was handed over to a Halifax alderman named James R. Graham to sort out. They survived it. They survived a fire in 1891 that burned the Halifax factory down. They survived, the way hard companies do, by being harder than the trouble. Because Moir was a hard employer, and the record is clear about that too. His journeymen bakers went on strike in 1868. In 1884, a trades union mounted a province-wide boycott of Moir's products. And when the bakers won a 9-hour day in 1890, William Moir fired the union men and replaced them the following year. Children worked those floors. The hours were long. Mackay's judgment of the man was that his single-minded hunger for profit showed both the achievement and the cost of building industrial capitalism in a young country. That's the truth underneath the rainbow. Before Moir's was beloved, it was formidable, and the sweetness came later. Chapter 2. The largest candy factory in Canada. By the turn of the century, the bread was an afterthought, and the candy was the future. In 1891, the firm was renamed Moir, Son and Company. In 1903, chocolate became a formal line under a new company, Moirs Limited, and a refining plant and a wooden box mill went up at Bedford. The Moirs were now, unambiguously, chocolate makers. The Garrison bakery had become something else entirely. It didn't happen without family cost. In 1907, James's brother, Ben Moir, left after a dispute and went off to start his own bakery. And that bakery, Ben's Bread, became a Halifax institution in its own right, feeding the city for generations under a different name. Two brothers, two empires, one falling out. The kind of thing that happens in family firms and gets remembered at kitchen tables long after the boardroom forgets. Then, on the 6th of December, 1917, the north end of Halifax was destroyed. Two ships collided in the Narrows, one of them packed with wartime explosives, and the blast that followed was the largest human-made explosion the world had seen before the atomic bomb. Something close to 2,000 people died. 9,000 were injured. The Moir's candy factory stood downtown on Argyle Street, south of the worst of it, and there is no reliable record that the building itself was badly damaged. But the workers were Halifax people, and Halifax people were caught in the blast. Families on Brunswick Street, sisters and daughters who went to work sorting chocolates and came home to a flattened neighborhood. The factory kept its doors. The city around it did not. And out of that shattered decade came the boom. In the 1920s, James W. Moir reorganized and modernized the whole operation, and Moir's became something the Maritimes had never produced before, a national brand. Employment climbed past 1,100 workers, 1,126 by one count, not including the salesmen out on the road. In 1927, a new 9-story building rose on Argyle Street, roughly 175,000 square feet, filling an entire city block. At night, a giant illuminated sign spelled out Moirs over the rooftops of Halifax. You could see it from the harbor. It was, plainly and without exaggeration, the largest candy factory in Canada. Walk into that building in the 1920s, and the first thing that would strike you was that the work was divided by sex, rigidly and completely. The men made the candy and ran the machines. The women did everything else: sorting, packing, wrapping, weighing, inspecting, and above all, hand-dipping, the delicate craft of coating a soft center in chocolate by hand. It took 2 years to learn to hand-dip correctly. 2 years. And the women who could do it were paid by the piece, by the finished chocolate, their hands moving with a speed and precision that no one had taught them in school. Here is the fact that tells you what Moir's was to this city. In 1891, 3 of every 5 women working outside the home in Halifax worked at Moir's. 3 in 5. The factory wasn't just an employer. For the working women of Halifax, it was very nearly the entire economy. And then, in 1928, Moir's invented the thing that would outlive everything else about it. They called it pot of gold. It was the first mixed assortment box of chocolates ever sold in Canada. A single box holding many different centers, so you didn't have to choose one flavor, you got all of them, hidden under identical shells like a small edible mystery. On the lid, a rainbow and a young woman, and the promise the whole country would come to know, that at the end of the rainbow was a pot of gold. Over the next 35 years, 11 different women would appear on that box. The last of them arrived at Christmas, 1974. Moirs pioneered wrapping the whole thing in clear cellophane to keep it fresh. They advertised the chocolates as known on 3 continents, with sales agencies in the West Indies, in Central and South America, in South Africa and New Zealand. A candy factory in Nova Scotia, sending its boxes around the world. The bread for the garrison was 2 generations gone. What the Moirs had built instead was a rainbow. Chapter 3. We all know where the rainbow goes. Imagine standing on the pavement outside that Argyle Street building on a cold morning in the 1950s, and the first thing you'd notice, before you saw anything at all, was the smell. Chocolate. Warm, dark, and everywhere. It drifted out of the factory and down the Halifax streets, and for the people who grew up in that city, it was simply part of the air. The way some towns smell of the sea, and some of wood smoke, Halifax, near Argyle Street, smelled of chocolate. It was a civic fact. You knew where you were by breathing. Inside, the craft was real and specific. The signature was a chocolate coating the company called Moirs XXX, developed by James W. Moir, together with a man named L.E. Covey, who had joined the firm in 1878 at the age of 15 and risen to become superintendent of chocolate making. A boy of 15 who learned the trade and spent a lifetime perfecting the exact snap and gloss of a Moir shell. The strawberry centers were made from 12,000 pounds of Nova Scotia strawberry jam a year. Fresh coconut came up from Jamaica twice a month. This was not industrial slurry. It was a food made by people who cared how it tasted, and the whole country came to depend on it for the same 2 days every year. Pot of gold became the default Canadian gift, the box you brought to the house at Christmas, the box you gave on Valentine's Day, the box that sat on the sideboard while the family argued over who got the last caramel. There was a television jingle that a generation could still hum decades later about knowing where the rainbow goes. The archivist Sarah Story has described the childhood ritual of it. The little printed map inside the lid that told you which chocolate was which, and the careful business of choosing that one special chocolate for the day. A Maritime factory had made itself into a national ritual. For a region that so often felt like it was watching the important things happen somewhere else, in Toronto, in Ottawa, in Montreal, Moirs was the rare thing, a Halifax product that the whole country wanted, the only business in the city with a truly national brand. The workers knew what they had, and in 1957, they did something no one in Canada had done before. 2 separate unions, the Teamsters, Local 927, and the Bakery and Confectionery Workers. International Union, Local 446, signed a single joint contract covering roughly 1,000 workers. It was the first time in Canadian history that 2 unions had come together on one agreement. A first made in a chocolate factory in Halifax. Not everything was sweet. The Second World War brought rationing of sugar and cocoa, and production suffered. And after the war, in 1947, when Moirs and the other makers raised the price of a chocolate bar from 5 cents to 8, the children of Canada revolted. A genuine nationwide candy bar strike. Kids picketing outside stores over the 3-cent betrayal. It didn't last. But for a few weeks, the country's children had opinions about confectionery pricing, and they made them known. This was the summit, the smell over the streets, the rainbow on the sideboard, the 11 women on 11 boxes. 1,000 and more workers, most of them women whose skill had taken years to build. And in 1956, quietly, the last Moir walked out of the building. His name was John C. McKean, a great-grandson of the founder, the last member of the family in management. When he retired, something ended that no one on the factory floor quite registered at the time. The family that had built the rainbow was done holding it. The chocolate still smelled the same the next morning. But the company no longer belonged to anyone who had grown up smelling it. Chapter 4. Sold down the river. What happened next didn't happen in a day. It happened over 50 years, one transaction at a time, and each step seemed reasonable to the people who signed it. That's how these things usually go. Nobody in a boardroom ever decides to destroy a beloved company. They decide to sell a division, to merge an operation, to rationalize a footprint. The destruction is only visible at the end, looking back along the chain. The chain started in 1956 and 57. With John McKean gone, the company was reorganized under a new president, F.M. Covert, and sold out of the family to a group of maritime businessmen. Still local. Still Halifax hands on the wheel. But the founding bloodline was out. In the 1960s, a federal tax on confectionery landed, and it landed hardest on the maritime makers, on Moirs, and on their old rival Ganong down in New Brunswick, because they sat farthest from the big central Canadian markets. Distance had always been the maritime problem. Now the tax made distance cost money. It was an early warning of a structural truth the region would learn again and again. When the rules are written in Ottawa for the benefit of the center, the edges pay. In 1967, the candy division was sold again, this time to Standard Brands Limited. The Moirs name was kept because the name was worth keeping, but the owner now sat outside the region. In 1973, Standard Brands bought Loney, an American chocolate company with a Canadian branch plant, and combined the two operations. Moirs' chocolate bar production moved out to the Loney plant in Quebec, and Loney's boxed chocolate work moved into the Moirs plant. Pieces of the company were now being shuffled between provinces like inventory, because that's what they had become, inventory. In 1975, a new, modern Moirs factory opened in the Woodside area of South Dartmouth, across the harbor. Production migrated out of the old downtown Argyle Street complex, the 9-story building with the glowing sign, and the following year, in 75 and 76, that landmark was demolished. Today, part of that block holds a convention center and a federal government office. The Moirs sign that had lit the Halifax sky for half a century came down, and most people barely noticed it go. In 1981, Standard Brands merged into Nabisco, and the whole thing became part of Nabisco Brands. And then, on the 29th of June, 1987, the American giant arrived. Hershey Canada bought the assets and the trademark rights to Nabisco's Canadian confectionery and snack nut businesses for roughly $162 million American dollars, businesses that had done about $135 million in sales the year before. Here is the detail that matters, the one the popular story always gets wrong. Hershey never bought Moirs from the Moir family. Hershey never sat across a table from a Moir. By the time the Americans arrived, the family had been gone for 30 years, and the Moirs brand came to Hershey fourth hand, bundled into a job lot with Loney, Lifesavers, Planters Peanuts, O. Henry and Chip-Its, one-line item on a long invoice. That's what 170 years of Halifax chocolate had become. A trademark in a portfolio, owned by a company in Pennsylvania that had never smelled the chocolate on Argyle Street, because there was no more Argyle Street. The historian Ian McKay, who had traced the whole arc, put it with a kind of grim precision. Moirs had been a flagship of homegrown maritime capital. It had survived the great wave of corporate mergers at the end of the 19th century. What it could not survive was the wave that came at the beginning of the 21st. And beneath all of it ran the deeper current, the one that carried away so much of Canadian manufacturing in exactly these years. In 1988, Canada signed a free trade agreement with the United States. In 1994, it widened into a continental agreement, including Mexico. Neither one closed the Dartmouth plant. What they did was quieter than that. They made it easy to serve the Canadian market from a factory anywhere on the continent, easy to consolidate production into fewer, larger plants, easy for a company in Pennsylvania to look at a small factory in Nova Scotia and see not a heritage, but a redundancy. The border had always been close. Now, the wall along it was coming down. Chapter 5. Pennsylvania Math. The decision that ended Moirs was not made in Halifax, or in Dartmouth, or anywhere in Nova Scotia. It was made in Hershey, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 2007, by people doing arithmetic on a continental scale. The man at the head of it was Richard H. Lenny, chairman, president, and chief executive of the Hershey Company, who had run the firm since 2001. Beside him was David J. West, named chief operating officer in the January of that year, a man being groomed to take over. And the arithmetic in front of them was brutal in its simplicity. Hershey's manufacturing network was running at less than half its capacity. Half. Too many plants, not enough demand to fill them, and a board, including the powerful Hershey Trust, growing restless with flat sales and a share price that wouldn't move. So on the 15th of February, 2007, 2 days after the board approved it, Hershey announced what it called a global supply chain transformation. Stripped of the language, it was this: cut roughly 1,500 jobs across the supply chain, reduce the number of production lines by more than a third, push the low-value products out to other manufacturers, and build a new, flexible, low-cost plant in Monterrey, Mexico. The numbers Hershey attached to the plan were enormous. Pre-tax costs of $525 to $575 million, annual savings of $170 to $190 million by the year 2010, and a stated goal that read, "To a Canadian ear, like a small mercy and a large threat at once." When it was all done, about 80% of the company's production would still take place in the United States and Canada, 80% in North America, which meant that 20% would not be. And it meant that somewhere in that reshuffling, some plants would live and some would die. And the ones that died would be the small ones, the old ones, the ones farthest from head office and least costly to abandon. The ones, in other words, exactly like Dartmouth. The plan did not land gently, even in Pennsylvania. At the Hershey annual meeting that April, shareholders stood up and invoked the memory of Milton Hershey himself, the founder who had built a town and a school for orphans, whose whole legend was that a chocolate company could look after its people. They asked how his company could now be cutting 1,500 jobs and building a factory in Mexico. It was a tense room. By the middle of the year, with second quarter profit down 96%, Richard Lenny announced he would retire. The architect of the transformation would not be there to see it finished. There were people inside the industry who understood immediately what the plan really meant. Dennis Baumberger, who ran the Chocolate Workers Union Local, representing 2,500 workers at Hershey's own Pennsylvania plants, did the math out loud in the February of that year. If Hershey was going to add jobs in Mexico while promising a net reduction of 1,500, then the actual cuts in the existing plants would have to go deeper than the headline number suggested. The Mexican jobs had to be paid for somewhere. They would be paid for in closed factories. The first Canadian casualty was named that same February, the plant at Smiths Falls, Ontario, a town where Hershey had been part of the local identity for decades. Nova Scotia watched Smiths Falls and understood the shape of what was coming. When a company announces it is shrinking its network by a third, and it has already named one Canadian plant, the people in the other Canadian plant do not sleep well. In Dartmouth, they waited through the spring. The chocolate kept moving down the lines at the Woodside plant. The handwork went on. And in Pennsylvania, the memo that would decide their futures was already written, waiting for a date. The date came in May. Chapter 6, 580. On the 9th of May, 2007, a Hershey spokesman named Kirk Saville delivered the sentence that ended it. Hershey would close its last factory in Canada by December. The Moirs plant in Dartmouth would shut. Nearly 600 people would lose their jobs. The precise figure Hershey gave was 580. 580 jobs in a plant that had once employed more than 1,000. Reporters rounded it to nearly 600, and both numbers were true, and both were smaller than the plant had been. Because the shrinking had started long before. Just before Christmas of 2006, when the busy season ended, Hershey had already laid off around 500 of roughly 820 workers and warned that many might never be called back. The company had even, in late 2006, floated the idea of simply selling off the Pot of Gold brand, the 78-year-old Rainbow, because it no longer fit the corporate strategy. The closure in May was not a bolt from the blue. It was the last stroke of something that had been happening quietly for months. Saville gave the reason without flinching. The Dartmouth plant, he said, was running at only 30% of its capacity. Hershey had looked at the alternatives to closing it, he told the Globe and Mail, and none of them would have made the plant competitive. 30%. A factory built to run at full was running at less than a third, and a company doing continental arithmetic had decided that a third was not enough. Now, Here is where the story people tell diverges from the story the record supports, and both deserve to be spoken. Many Nova Scotians will tell you the plant was profitable when Hershey killed it, that the Americans shut a money-making factory purely to chase cheap Mexican labor. It is a powerful belief, and you can understand why people hold it. But there is no documented proof the plant was profitable, and Hershey's own account, 30% capacity, uncompetitive, points the other way. What can be said for certain is where the work went, and it was not simply Mexico. Saville was explicit. Some production would move to Hershey's existing plants, some to manufacturing partners and subcontractors, including a major chocolate maker called Barry Callebaut, and some to the new facility in Monterey. The work was split three ways. Mexico was a piece of it. It was never the whole of it. But the piece that stung was the piece that had come from home. Because in 2003, just 4 years before the closure, after Hershey had spent around $20 million expanding the very plant it was now shutting, the province of Nova Scotia had helped pay for it. A provincial payroll rebate worth up to $750,000 if the plant created and kept jobs. A term loan of $480,000 to buy land. Public money, Nova Scotia's money, had modernized the Woodside plant. 4 years later, the modernized plant was being closed, and its work carried off the continent in part. The reaction was immediate, and it came from every level of government. The workers were represented by the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco Workers, and Grain Millers Union, Local 446, and their representative, David LeBlanc, negotiated what he called a good severance package, and then watched the plans for the site with a bitterness he didn't hide, knowing the manufacturing jobs would eventually be traded for a smaller number of retail jobs. The mayor of Halifax, Peter Kelly, wrote to Premier Rodney MacDonald calling it a devastating blow, noting that generations of families had worked in that plant, and personally reaching out to other confectioners, to the Weston Company, to the Ganong family in New Brunswick, trying to find someone, anyone, who might buy it and keep the chocolate flowing. No buyer came, and in Ottawa, years later, the Member of Parliament for the area, Mike Savage, would stand in the House of Commons and recount what it had been like. The union had come to him for help. Service Canada had stepped in for the workers. And he said one thing that, in the wreckage, counted as a mercy, that these workers, unlike others he could name, had not lost their pensions. It was not the only blow that spring. Barely a month earlier, on the 4th of April, an Oregon company had announced the closure of the Trenton Works railcar shops in Trenton, Nova Scotia, another 300 jobs and more, gone to lower-cost production elsewhere. Two icons of Nova Scotia manufacturing, lost inside 5 weeks. To the people watching, it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a pattern. It felt like the tide going out. At the plant, a machine operator named Ken Drake, 12 years on the floor, said the thing everyone was feeling. What is life after here? It's the unknown, he said, that's scaring people. They had until Christmas to find out. Chapter 7. The Last Batch. The last chocolate came off the line at the Woodside plant on Thursday, the 20th of December, 2007. The final day was the Friday, the 21st. Nearly 600 people. Some of them had given the plant most of their working lives. Gail Bezenson had been there 27 years. They held me in a job for 27 years, she said. Now she was waiting to see if the government would help pay for whatever came next. Janet Terriol had started at 16. She left after 33 years. Someone asked if she was sad. Yes, she said, because they're taking our Canadian product. Joni Swicker, 6 years in, knew what the last day would be. There would be tears, she said. There were people who had been there a very long time. And Christina Fuller, who everyone called Missy, said the thing that named the whole loss. I thought I was going to retire there, she said. There were sons and daughters working alongside their parents. That was the truth of a place like Moirs, the truth that no capacity figure on a Pennsylvania spreadsheet could hold. It was not 580 positions. It was mothers and daughters on the same line. It was men who had followed their fathers through the gate. It was the 2-year apprenticeship of the hand, passed down. The plant was a family in the way that only a place that employs generations can be, and when it closed, it did not lay off workers. It severed a lineage. The national broadcaster reached for the largest frame it could, and it was not too large. This was the end, the report said, of a 200-year-old candy-making tradition in the region. Now the last chapter of the folklore. Many Canadians will tell you that after the work went south, the chocolate melted in transit, that the quality fell apart, that furious Canadians rose up and boycotted the brand. It is a satisfying story, the villain punished by the loss of what he stole. But the reputable record does not carry it. There is no documented account of a melting in transit disaster. There was no organized national boycott. What there was, and this is real, this can be heard in 1,000 kitchen conversations, was grief, and a quiet, persistent complaint that the pot of gold you can buy now doesn't taste the way it used to, that the creams changed, that something left when the plant did. Whether that's the chocolate or the memory of the chocolate, no one can prove. But the feeling is genuine, and it has never gone away. What is certain is quieter and heavier than any boycott. On the 21st of December, the machines that had run for decades stopped. The hand dippers set down their work. The particular sound a working factory makes, not just the machinery, but the movement of hundreds of people, the ventilation, the low hum that a town stops hearing because it never stops. That sound ended. And into the space it left came the other thing, the silence that doesn't belong. Worse in winter, when the Nova Scotia cold fills whatever the sound leaves behind. The smell went too. The chocolate that had drifted over the streets of Halifax and Dartmouth for the better part of a century simply wasn't there anymore. You'd walk past and breathe, out of an old habit, and get nothing but December air. Chapter 8. Where the Rainbow Went. The plant did not sit empty for long, and what came to fill it told its own quiet story. Even before the closure, in the November of 2007, the Woodside site was bought by a developer, Southwest Properties, with plans to turn it into a retail center. Whatever hope had lingered that another chocolate maker might take it over, that the Weston Company or Ganong might step in as the mayor had begged, died with the sale. David LeBlanc, the union man, said what it amounted to. 600 manufacturing jobs would be replaced by a smaller number of assorted retail jobs. Where chocolate had been made, things would now be sold. There was a further irony in the ground itself. Years earlier, an expansion had turned up petroleum contamination in the soil. The land under the sweetest factory in Canada needed cleaning before the next thing could be built on it. Across the road, a joint provincial-federal transition center opened to help the workers find their footing. And here, the numbers say something sad and complicated. A provincial official named Stuart Gourlay noted the following August that of the roughly 600 workers, only 267 had come forward for retraining help. Partly, he said, because the severance packages had been decent enough that people didn't need to rush. But there's another reading, harder to put in a report. Many of these workers were in their 50s. They had spent their lives learning one trade, the exact craft of chocolate, in one plant. What retraining, in a small maritime economy, do you offer to a 55-year-old master hand dipper? Some of them left. For Ontario, for Alberta, the way Maritimers have always left when the work goes. The outmigration that has bled the region for a century took its cut of Moirs too. As for the rainbow itself, it survived. It's the strangest part of the whole story. Pot of Gold is still on the shelves. You can buy it in Canada today, at Walmart, at Canadian Tire, sold under the name Hershey's Pot of Gold. The historian Janice Thiessen put it exactly. The brand lives on, but not in Canada, and not by Moirs. Hershey's own annual filing for 2008 confirmed it in the flat language of accounting. The Dartmouth facility, along with plants in Montreal and California, had been closed and sold. Smiths Falls and a plant in Connecticut closed and held for sale. The rainbow was now made somewhere else, by someone else, for a company that had inherited it fourth hand and closed the last hands that had made it. One thing of the old empire is still standing. Out at Bedford, on the 9 Mile River, where William Moir once poured his profits into mills and timber and boxes, there is a small concrete building, the Moirs Powerhouse, built in 1931 to make electricity for the works. It survived when everything around it vanished. It's on the Canadian Register of Historic Places now, restored and repurposed as a tourist bureau. The last physical relic of a 200-year empire is a powerhouse that outlived the power. People stop there for directions, mostly, and never know what it was. So consider for a moment 2 objects that Nova Scotia still sends out into the world. The first is the box, the rainbow, the young woman, the map inside the lid, the caramel someone always fought over. It's still out there, on a shelf near you, made far from the harbor it came from. The country the Moirs built it for still buys it, out of habit, out of memory, and half the people who buy it will say it isn't quite what it was. The second is a tree. Every winter, in thanks for the help Boston sent after the explosion of 1917, Nova Scotia cuts one of its finest evergreens and ships it south as a gift, and Boston lights it, and has done for more than 100 years. A whole province remembering a kindness with something it grew itself. 2 things given away. 1 a box that survived without the place that made it. 1 a tree the place still makes, every single year, and gives freely, and asks nothing back. A homegrown maritime icon lasted through fires, near ruin, the largest explosion of its age, 2 world wars, and 4 changes of owner. It could not last being owned by people who had never smelled the chocolate on Halifax's streets. Not through 1 betrayal, through a long, patient handing away, a division sold, a plant moved, a name bundled onto an invoice, until the rainbow led out of the country, and the smell went out of the air, and all that was left standing was a little powerhouse on the 9 Mile River, keeping the lights on for a company that no longer exists.